Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. That's right, we're back in your feeds for a second time this month for a special bonus episode. This month marks the 9th anniversary of socialprotection.org, and across the platform, we're celebrating partnerships for social protection. In this episode, we're talking about the importance of partnerships in navigating diverse perspectives and policies within global social protection. My guests are Shahra Razavi, Director of the Universal Social Protection Department at the International Labour Organization, and Ifat Sharif, Global Director for Social Protection and Jobs at the World Bank Group. Together, these institutions co-chair key platforms like the Social Protection Interagency Cooperation Board, that goes by the name of SPIAC-B, and the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection, or USP 2030. They talk candidly about the sometimes heated policy differences and debate within this sector, and the importance of collaboration in bridging these divides and driving progressive expansion of social protection worldwide. It's a wide-ranging conversation about how far the sector has come and the most significant challenges it will need to grapple with for the future. Welcome, Shahra and Ifat.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us.
Shahra, as I just mentioned, the ILO and the World Bank are co-chairs of SPIAC-B and USP 2030. Can you tell me briefly a little bit about those two platforms and what they were established to do?
Sure. The SPIAC-B, it was born out of a request by the G20 in 2011 to really have a mechanism which can help improve coordination and collaboration in the social protection sector between the different agencies. USP 2030, as you said, the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, is what I would call an advocacy network, which was launched in 2016, just a year after the 2030 Agenda was put in place in 2015. And both these partnerships really operate through various working groups that we have under them. We have, for example, a working group on climate change, one on financing, on digitalization, on food systems, together with the humanitarian nexus, on gender equality. And I think despite the many policy differences that we have among the agencies, these collaborations have really been very helpful to create a joint understanding of what social protection is about, of fostering cooperation and helping to improve the kind of coordination that we do on social protection interventions. And I think we can see the usefulness of these bodies when we look at the way in which we were able to respond as a sector to some of the real challenges that we've been facing. Just to give you one example, we had a very nice COVID-19 statement that was put together under SPIAC-B at the end of March 2020. This was only 2 months after WHO declared the coronavirus outbreak to be a public health emergency. And the statement was really talking about the importance of social protection systems as a response to the pandemic. And it was downloaded like 16,000 times within a few days of its publication. So it really enabled us to come together and have a kind of strong voice in terms of the importance of social protection systems in that context. And if I can just end by saying the fact that both the World Bank and ILO are the two co-chairs, I think it really contributes to giving these partnerships sort of greater authority and legitimacy. And this we have seen in recent months. For example, we have been called upon as SPIAC-B by the Brazilian presidency of G20 to produce a paper on the role of social protection in combating hunger and poverty as one of the inputs that went into the Alliance on Combating Poverty and Hunger that has now been launched by the Brazilian presidency of the G20.
Ifat, as we've said, both SPIAC-B and USP 2030's mandates are, of course, really strongly linked to SDG 1.3 on achieving substantial coverage of social protection for the poor and vulnerable. We've just heard from Shahra some great examples of this, but for you, why is this kind of interagency cooperation and partnership so important for achieving this goal in particular?
I think Shara mentioned two of them. One is that she mentioned advocacy, right? The need that these partnerships and platforms help to bring governments and agencies and organizations together and advocate. The second thing she mentioned is collaboration. Extremely important to kind of have this dialogue among partners and countries. And I think this leads me to my third reason as to why this is important, because they also offer sharing of evidence and building of evidence by working both across agencies, but within countries. And I think this is why I really value both the bodies, because I think while you have an SPIAC-B, some of the agencies and partners in USP 2030, you have a larger body, including country level representation from CBOs and NGOs. And we need to, in fact, think of how you elevate the game for us and use these partnerships better to work better and achieve higher goals, because the need is just tremendous. So, the latest work we have from data from 148 countries is that 3 out of 4 extreme poor people in low-income countries still do not have access to any basic social protection. So clearly, the financing needs, the outreach needs, the program needs, it's just tremendous. And so given that, to achieve at least make a dent to the SDG goal that you mentioned, we do need the systematic collaboration and advocacy and sharing of evidence of what works in what circumstances and how become extremely critical.
Shara, what are some other examples of how joint initiatives or this kind of collaboration that we're talking about have improved social protection systems around the world?
Maybe just say a little bit about the fact that we have also come some distance. I think this interagency work has really created a greater convergence of views. And I want to give a few kind of issues that I think are really important. One is around the importance of building comprehensive systems. And you see this now across many agencies, even those that were very much involved in much more ad hoc kind of humanitarian responses, for example. Now, 15, 20 years ago, I don't think we could say everyone was convinced of the importance of system building. Whereas I think now we have kind of really moved beyond the kind of ad hoc residual responses and really thinking much more, even in humanitarian contexts, about not creating parallel structures, about really trying to build systems. Another, I think, which has been quite interesting is this emphasis on the life cycle approach. That, everyone needs social protection along the life cycle and not just at particular moments in life. That also is another area where I think we have a lot more convergence now. Even UNICEF was very much focused on children and child benefits and children's well-being and rights. They are much more now kind of also open to looking at the way in which social protection for the family members of those children also can really make a difference for children. And the other issue I want to end on is around women needing also their own income security and not just being dependents of men. Some of the critique of conditionalities that have been quite punitive. And now I think as international organizations, we would all be a bit hesitant about what kind of conditionalities do we advocate, and do these really become barriers to women's participation and women's ability to access benefits. So it's fair to say that, like within SPIAC-B, and we do have a gender working group, and I think that has provided a very important platform for those who work on gender to carry their gender work into the social protection community.
Ifat, as Shara has already started to allude to, there are a lot of different perspectives on how social protection should work, and even to some degree what best practice sometimes looks like. As a community, we've sometimes been quite polarised around questions like what methods of targeting or distribution are most equitable and efficient, how the systems that underpin programs should work. We talked about conditionality and unconditionality just then as well. How do these partnerships navigate these different views in a way that keeps the sector moving forward?
I think, broadly speaking, as Shara explained, all of the agencies have the same goal in mind, right? We do want to make sure that those who are in need have the access to some form of social protection when they need it. And it's okay to have different approaches to get to that goal as long as you're moving the needle. And I think that pragmatic approach has worked and has really helped us come together and move in our own way, making progress. So if I just look at just the World Bank, for example, in 2008, when the Triple F crisis hit, we're at a financing level of $6 billion, right? Now, fast forward 15 years, our financing has gone up to 30 billion. We are working in 72 countries. This has happened with a lot of collaboration with partners, development partners, including with the UN agencies, in many places as implementation partners. So I can think of examples like in the Sahel, we have a fantastic, massive engagement building adaptive social protection systems where UNICEF and WFP are implementation partners. We have development partners like Germany, Denmark, France, UK, supporting that engagement. So this kind of making sure what works and where we have the entry points and moving along. I think it seems like a pragmatic approach, knowing that we may have differences in opinion, how you target, what model you use, whether you use community-based targeting versus PMT, and there's a lot of differences in opinion. And I think it's okay to have those opinions. And that's why I mentioned earlier the importance of building evidence of what kind of mechanisms and policies make sense. When I look at our own experience of the last 15, 20 years, the three things that come out as lessons that I hope that us as a community will take forward is that one thing we know for sure, that program design matters because we know that implementation matters. You can have the best design, whether it's a targeting model or some other forms of design in terms of type of benefit. But that implementation, if it doesn't happen on the ground properly, you're not going to get the impact. And thirdly, what we're seeing for the many reasons Shara mentioned in terms of the life cycle, the income risks people face, the transitions the world is going through, whether it's climate, whether it's technology, whether it's demographic, you need to think about a mix of instruments. We've been focusing a lot on ex post interventions. We need to think about ex ante social insurance mechanisms because we are living in a world of high risks, and COVID just taught us. So I think there's so much to be done that keeping our eyes focused on where we can actually move the needle and make progress.
Shada, coming to you, you talked a little bit about the policy differences that do exist between agencies and governments and in this space. Can you say a little bit more about how you've seen those differences, kind of manifest or come out at different times? And again, how you see the role of these kinds of dialogues and partnerships in order to keep things moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I do want to say that I really agree with Ifat about the need for kind of pragmatism. And that's why I think when we work together in countries, it really does help in really being much more hands-on and seeing the concrete issues. And I think it's easier to move together. And as Ifat rightly said, to make sure that we're kind of moving the needle, even if we don't agree on everything. So with that as my jumping board, I do want to still sort of highlight some of the things on which we need to work harder to see whether we can reach a greater sort of understanding on it. One is, for example, on the definition and scope of social protection. When it comes to social services, for example, something like childcare services. Is this within the scope of social protection or is it somewhere else? Active labor market policies or economic inclusion programs. So on the scope and definition of social protection, there's still quite some differences that are important to sort of discuss and to work on. How to sequence the progressive extension, of course, of social protection. And if certain groups that we know are vulnerable should be prioritized first. The degree to which we have targeting or even conditionalities attached or not in the provision of social protection. These are all very kind of contested issues, and we have some work there to do. I was really pleased to hear Ifat mention the role of social protection as kind of more ex-ante support for people who will need responses to the risks that they face. And so the role of social insurance in particular in the realization of social protection and universal coverage of social protection will be a very important area that we can do a lot more on. And that really also relates to this whole question of how we link or delink social protection from employment. This has been another kind of, at some level, a contentious issue, with the World Development Report in 2019 arguing for a delinking. And, we see an important role for keeping some connection between employment and labor markets, particularly through building of social insurance systems where both employers and workers make contributions. So that's another issue on which I hope we can make some more progress on by working together. And it's not just about, I think, the ILO and World Bank. I'm talking about differences among many different agencies, the more development-oriented, normative versus maybe the more humanitarian. So we do have a lot of differences. And I think it's important to be realistic. We don't expect full consensus immediately. And these always require working through things, both at the level of conceptual discussions, but also much more importantly, in terms of what works concretely, what has worked, and having good assessments of those successes and also learning from the failures.
Thank you. And it is a really important reminder that those of us who work in social protection come at it from a range of perspectives, backgrounds, as of course do countries that we might be trying to work with or advocate with, cultural perspectives, historical, political perspectives that really shape the way the sector can grow in those places. I did want to dig down briefly into the question of achieving universal social protection by 2030. The clock is ticking on that. As you noted, if there are still so many people that aren't covered in any way. And yet it's a huge challenge. There are those who would start with categorical programs and build out from there. You've talked both about the need to have social assistance coupled with social insurance and the role of the private sector and employment in that mix as well. So just to take both of your institutions specifically in this case, do you think that the World Bank and ILO have always had the same vision of how to get from where we are to achieving universal social protection?
I think this is a great question, Joe, because we are right in the midst of actually putting out our own plans going forward in terms of doing exactly what you mentioned, country by country, looking at how we move in terms of increasing the coverage of our programs. Just recently at the Rio ministerial event of the G20, you may have heard our president put out an ambition for us of reaching 500 million poor and vulnerable people with social protection coverage. So that sort of is going to be our North Star, if you will, as we think through in country after country where we are supporting these programs, how we do this. It's about how we move across income distribution and really reach the poorest in a systematic way by building country level national programs, right? And this is where I think what Shara was mentioning is a great platform, we believe, where every agency is working in country X can come together and think about what does this mean for the country's ambition to reach that 500 million at least by 2030, and how we do this together. So in that sense, are we going to achieve universal social protection by 2030? I have my doubts, but at least we should have some sort of a metric to put out for us to move the needle. And I think the 500 million ambition that the president has put out is an effort to kind of galvanize everyone's focus and saying, okay, let's at least try to achieve that. And so we are now in the process of thinking through our action plan for country after country, how this will happen. I'm delighted that we already have actually an engagement with the ILO and our other UN partners called the multi-stakeholder engagement to support the Global Accelerator and the World Bank's own strategy of achieving increased coverage. So there are different mechanisms where we could bring together our partners to think through how we do this. And in doing so, maybe address some of the new innovations that need to happen in the process. But just getting the basic coverage still seems like a really tall order.
That's right. I mean, a long way to go, but as you say, we can only keep going and expand from where we are. Shada, what do you think in terms of that vision for achieving universal social protection and where the differences lie in that debate and perhaps how that debate has changed over time?
Yeah, thanks. It was really good to hear Ifat talk about the high-level commitment in the World Bank to reaching greater coverage of social protection. And that's one thing on which obviously our leadership kind of see eye to eye. I think for our Director General, and he's made it very clear, social protection and universal social protection is really one of the main kind of areas that he would like to see bigger progress on. And we have just come out a couple of months ago with the recent estimates that we have in terms of what the social protection gaps are. I mean, it's still about half of the world's population that does not have access to any form of social protection, any form of benefit. And our new estimates that are going to be released on the 12th of September, unfortunately, don't show a huge progress. And we have also, on that basis, done this kind of estimate of the financing gap. And we see that in 2024, low and middle income countries, the financing gap to have sort of a basic social protection floor, including essential healthcare, would cost about 3.3% of GDP annually. That is additional investment of 3.3% of GDP, which is about 1.4 trillion US dollars per year, every year, 1.4 trillion. Now, with all the richness in the world that is around, obviously that is a number that is within reach. But when it goes down to countries, and particularly low-income countries, this gap is much, much bigger as a percentage of GDP. So the way left to go is a long way. We have a huge gap to close. And I would say that for low-income countries in particular, there really needs to be a change, not only at the national level and domestic level, in order to be able to kind of mobilize the necessary resources, but also there needs to be some changes, some positive changes in the global financial architecture that would really help rather than undermine their efforts. But at least in terms of prioritizing universal social protection, it's great to know that at the highest level in our organizations, there is a commitment to universal social protection. And I hope through greater collaboration of the type that Ifat was referring to under the Global Accelerator, which is a UN initiative, but we do have within that component that's working very closely also with the World Bank. We hope to see good progress in the few countries where we are working together, but also good kind of examples of how that can be done so that we can use those collaborative, concrete examples to really benefit many other countries beyond the few that we may be working on under any particular sort of initiative.
I just want to say, while the ambition is there and the needs, and Shara mentions the tremendous financing needs, I'm also very hopeful with what I see country after country in terms of the innovations that's happening on the ground. We've just recently done a whole global database of how many countries actually have what we are calling dynamic social registries, which really help build the foundations for these adaptive social protection systems that Shara also mentioned. And increasingly, we are finding how countries are adopting new technology, new ways of doing things, and investing in these delivery systems that really then help you scale faster, better. And I think that is a great point of entry in many of our countries, because building the systems will really help us to also not only just get to more people faster and better, but also start innovating on the kind of programs we need that move from non-contributory schemes to contributory schemes. And some of the things that we were also talking about, the social insurance programs, savings products, and financial inclusion, and all of the kind of potential that could be unlocked if you build the plumbing of these programs right. And so there, I think that a lot of scope remains where we could be working with building these national country level mechanisms with which you can then innovate and really tailor the responses and support that is needed.
Shada, of course, this platform, socialprotection.org, was established to foster some of the kind of collaboration that we've been talking about today. It was set up as a recommendation of the G20 Development Working Group some years ago as a way to generate knowledge and facilitate its exchange on social protection with a focus on low and middle income countries. SPIAC-B and the USP agenda have partnered with us since we launched 9 years ago. What do you see as the value of this platform in supporting these partnerships that we've been talking about today?
I'm so glad you asked this question. Really, really, I think it is important to say our bits for socialprotection.org because you really do provide a really important, what I would call a global public good for our sector. And you've done an amazing job despite the many challenges that you have also faced over the years. So I think the platform is really valuable because of the services that it provides to us as the members, because of its independence and unbranded knowledge sharing and learning platform. The fact that it's agency neutral, it's not aligned with one agency or the other, and therefore really important to have this kind of neutral space. So for that, I think that you can be an honest broker of ideas and opinions and evidence. And this is really something that all of us cherish and value. And we thank you for that, for all the great work that you do. I think there's a great value of a partnership in the way that the platform is implementing the fact that it is based in the global south, based in Brazil, a country that champions social protection and that has a lot to offer in terms of best practices and good practices, and very much at the forefront on many of the policy issues that we discuss and we try to sort of learn from and also share with our constituents. So that's also, I think, has been very important. And then I think you've done a great job in terms of fostering exchange and learning and collaboration on social protection, focusing in particular on low and middle income countries. We know there's a lot more available for high income countries, but that focus for low and middle income countries is absolutely key. And you've done the right mix of providing up-to-date information and content for the sector, including using all the different sort of media that you use, whether it's publications or blogs or e-learning, the kind of live streaming that you do. We rely on you for all of our big events, for the webinars, the podcasts, the videos, country profiles, and so on. So really kudos to you, and we wish you a great continuation. And I'm also particularly pleased about the new marriage between your platform and UNRISD, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, where I worked for many, many years. So I was really happy to see that also come to fruition. So that's my kind of 2 pence on your great performance and role.
Yeah. Long before I came on board to produce this podcast, I knew the platform well as a practitioner myself. And like you, I think its real strength is in providing a neutral space to share lessons and express a diversity of experience and views. That's something we also try and achieve through this podcast as well, and the different voices that we bring into conversation with each other. So thank you for those kind words on behalf of everyone at socialprotection.org. Aoife, what do you see as being the key challenges going forward that will need the most collaboration or even more collaboration and these kinds of different perspectives to address?
The thing that keeps me up at night is the fact that we are facing a world of many transitions, and we have not necessarily come out of the COVID crisis and the economic crisis yet. And while countries are still facing huge debt distress issues, fiscal constraints, you also have increasing fragility. So in a world where the needs seem to be getting even more and more, the financing availability seems to be getting less and less for social protection programs. And so finding ways to come up with programs and policies that can help countries do more with less is going to be the fundamental challenge as to how do you advise ministers of finance or what programs to keep and what programs to cut and who to support and who not to support. I'm just thinking of Ethiopia went through massive macro policy reforms that is going to affect the poor. And we have riots happening in Kenya because of policy reforms that are again going to have an impact on the poor. You have rising number of youth coming into the labor force and with no jobs. You just saw what happened in Bangladesh recently. And so for me, the biggest challenge for us as a community will be to think about how do we find the best buys for social protection that we know will be the basic sort of foundation that countries need to think about, because the world is not going to change anytime soon. So in my mind, the whole narrative about only poor countries need social protection needs to change. And thinking through that all countries, regardless of their income levels, will need a social protection system that supports addressing chronic poverty, transient poverty, and the transitions that is going to come up. And designing the systems with that lens is going to be hard, but certainly very much needed. And this means not just looking at social policy, but I think Shara mentioned a little bit how social policy needs to intersect with labor policy, the labor markets, and how that needs to intersect with fiscal policy in terms of tax reforms, ways to bring about the additional resources, whether this is subsidy reform that has to happen and moving from a universal subsidy to targeted support for the poor. That whole space needs to get more complicated than it is currently. And I think for us, it's about being a social scientist to a labor economist to being a macroeconomist. And I think that thinking is going to be fundamental for the future of social protection. And that would mean a heavy lift from all of us to make sure that we are in all of these conversations and policy discussions, because the intersections between these three spaces are going to be even more complex, but very much needed.
Thank you. Shahar, what do you think? What are the key challenges going forward? And again, what's the role of collaboration and partnership in addressing those?
Well, I think my job has been made easier and we can save a bit of time because I agree with what Ifad said in terms of we all know that the needs are growing, whether it's in response to climate change, whether it's in response to the kind of fragilities that we see around the world that are creating huge population displacements, the fact that we have debt distress. So we know that the resources are shrinking. So I agree with the challenges. But I would also say we have to see the challenges for what they are. There are savings that can be done and efficiencies that can be gained, and that's very important, whether it's through having better efficient delivery systems, make sure there's not wastage of resources in the way policies are being delivered on the ground and so forth. But I don't think we want to get into a kind of triage mentality of saying, is it more efficient to invest in children, or do we need to get old people who really need support, or do we give pensions? Because we could get into those discussions as well. When resources are very limited, we have to make these really painful trade-offs. So I think while we do want to be a bit more efficient in terms of what happens at the national level, we have to recognize that many of the struggles that countries have, we live in a very globalized world, and we also need to pursue a global context that doesn't create a lot of these fallouts, which fall so heavily on very poor countries. Whether it's from climate change, we know the big polluters are not the low-income countries, but they pay the price in terms of the kind of disruptions that they get through all the climatic changes that is happening. We know interest rates goes up for other reasons, but again, it falls on very low-income developing countries to have to face debt distress. So yes, we have to work at the national level, but as international agencies, I think our value also comes in being able to identify certain changes in the global development and financial architecture that would make social protection policy and development policy more effective at the national level. And here I think, we have the financing for development for discussion coming up in 2025. This is a very good opportunity to try and sort of make the global financial architecture a bit more conducive to the needs of developing countries. Interesting discussions going on about a global convention on taxation. That would be very important. Having greater coordination so countries don't get foreign capital coming in by reducing taxation as a way of a race to the bottom, as it's called, which then hits them in terms of not being able to mobilize sufficient tax resources for investing in their social protection systems that they need. So we need better global coordination and better coordination that works for those that have the least voice in the kind of global forums where decisions are made.
Thank you. We like to end each episode with what we call our quick wins. That's when we ask our guests to bring in a resource that has sparked their interest in some way to share with our audience. Ifat, you brought in a paper by Banerjee et al. Titled Social Protection in the Developing World, which is fairly broad-ranging. What was it that sparked your interest about this paper in particular?
So what I really liked about this latest work from Brigitte and colleagues is that, it tries to help put the country context within which we need to think about social protection policies very clearly. It puts out the fundamental challenges that our country teams face when they go into a country and try to design programs, because context matters so much. So it was very clear, the paper really clearly talks about how to design social protection programs in a context where you have large informality and the constraints that informal economies present to design of policies, whether it's tax policies all the way, or lack of tax policies all the way to social protection. And what I liked about the paper is that it tried to kind of put, again, using very clear conceptual thinking, to put forward what I said earlier, the next set of challenges of how you start thinking about ex post interventions in social protection to ex ante, because the role of social insurance in an informal economy setup is even higher, right? Because of the fact that you don't have a mechanism with which you can manage your risks. And I thought this was a nice way to kind of start thinking about the sort of next horizon of new programs that we need to think about, and sort of linking ex post intervention with ex ante is not easy. But I also think that what was nice about the paper was it tried to present social protection programs as a way to help countries think of redistribution, right? And increasingly, and not as much as I would like, I see in country level dialogue, we see the discussion on social protection within the tax policy and tax reform discussions as to how can some of the investments we're making in social protection, such as in dynamic social registries, could be used as a mechanism to actually redistribute resources to those who need it, right? And so the idea of social protection investments could help in better tax policy is, to me, a new emerging insight that I would certainly like our teams to take forward in the conversations of this kind of linking between social policy, labor policy, and the fiscal and the macro policy discussion. So that's what I liked about this paper. It pushes us into a new space, if you will.
Thank you. That's a great pick. And Shada, you've brought in a slightly older pick back from 2019, which is the report of the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Why is this perhaps at top of mind for you?
Yeah, so on this one, I think there's a lot going on digital and digitalization of welfare states and social protection systems. And I think this paper of Philip Alston's, in the usual way that he is so very insightful, talks about this emerging reality in many countries, which is this, what he calls the digital welfare state, and how systems of social protection and social assistance are being increasingly driven by digital data and digital technologies, which are very helpful. They can be very efficient in terms of automating, in terms of identifying beneficiaries, but also a downside of being also able to survey, to detect, to target, to punish, and so forth, that he refers to. And here in this report, I think he kind of goes against the grain of only talking about sort of the positive side of the digital technology, to talk about the irresistible attraction for governments to move in this direction, and he acknowledges that, but also the risks of really, what he says, of stumbling zombie-like into a digital welfare dystopia, and the risks of it, particularly if it falls in the hands of those who want to use this technology to survey, to target, to punish. So I think it's a very important piece to keep in mind within this kind of enthusiasm about technology and about digital technology.
Thank you both, Shada Razavi and Ifat Sharif, for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you, Joe, for having us. This was extremely lovely to have this conversation. And so thank you, Shara, also for joining. It's so nice to see you again and connect.
Thank you very much to both of you. And it was great to have the opportunity to be on this podcast. And thank you so much for the opportunity. Really enjoyed it.
And thank you for listening to the Social Protection Podcast, brought to you by socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.